I'm 99% confident that's going to come up in the discussion.
Sure.
So let me turn first to Anna French from DFID.
Yes, it is going to come up.
Maybe if you just say who you are.
So I'm Anna French. I'm Head of Education Policy at DFID. You do make a very compelling case, Julia, for the kinds of things we should be investing in and how we bring in new partners such as business to make this very compelling case. But we have got this massive ambition, as Kevin has said, for the SDG, and it's going to take a big step change, a massive step change as well, in terms of that level of investment. But we are seeing donors, not DFID, but donor investment is falling. So what can we do? What do you think we need to do to achieve that step change?
I think, one of the things that was very visible for me as Prime Minister, because I governed in the post-global financial crisis era, is how much our world had changed with the global economy and how much our economic architecture reflected the old world. And so alongside the response to the global financial crisis, there was the demands to change the voting quotas of the IMF, for example, because they reflected who used to be the biggest economic powers in the world, not who today is the biggest economic powers in the world, are the biggest economic powers in the world. I think that there's a parallel there for how we think about the donor community. I can understand the frustration of donors that when we talk about this level of ambition and this much money being needed, that the same lot of donors then get under political pressure to stump up with more money. Now that doesn't mean that people like me won't continue to put you under that political pressure, I'm not saying that, but I am saying that the traditional donors club, going back to them from war, is not going to cut it given this gap. So we've got to make sure that we're reaching out to the emerging economies that don't like to be forced any longer into a categorisation of are you developing or are you a donor? A country like China, for example, one of the things we've got to think about at GPE, given our constituency structure, is if we got China to join, they would say, we don't want to sit in any of these constituencies because we're not any of these animals. We're a big economy, an emerging economy, but we're still pulling people out of poverty. So none of this architecture fits us. And what's true around the GPE board table is true of our aid architecture generally. So I think we've got to rethink it so that we can make it easier for emerging economies to become donors. And I think we've got to rethink it so that it is easier for private philanthropy to invest at scale. And we haven't as yet found the Bill Gates for education. Now, I think there's a whole series of reasons for that, the patient long-term time horizons, the paucity of the metrics, but if we can fix some of those things so it's clearer for that big philanthropist that he or she is making a true difference, then I think we will get them. But we haven't made it a compelling proposition for them yet.
When I said I was 99% sure, I promise you that was not a planted statement. What I want to do now is there are two more very brief questions I want to take before we throw it open. So first from Kitty from Save the Children, right at the back.
Hi, thank you. Is this on? Thank you very much. I was just going to pick up on one of Kevin's questions, actually, about children in conflict. So it's true that 40% of the children out of school are in conflict, 55% of those are girls. My question is about what more we need to do to protect the right to education of children caught up in emergencies and protracted crises. And we really welcome the moves that the GP has made to be ready and able to respond to emergencies. And you've been really instrumental in helping us take forward the discussion around a new funding mechanism or platform that you've already mentioned. It's for funding, but it's also for support and leadership. And I was wondering if you could actually tell us a little bit about how you might see that unfolding.
Thanks. And let's just take Susan as well. This is Susan Nicolai from ODI, who's actually writing the paper that you mentioned.
The expert.
Yeah, hi, Susan Nicolai with ODI. My question comes back to some of the discussion you were having on equity. And I mean, I think there's such a clear reality that marginalization is intersecting. And, you know, if we look at the gender gap and where those are most serious around the world, 4 out of 5 of those countries are actually crisis affected, conflict affected as well. 90% of the children around the world in developing countries with disabilities are out of school, and that becomes more extreme in systems that are fragile. And in addressing that is really the responsibility of national governments. The power in terms of education sits at the domestic level, and yet issues of inequity are not being prioritized domestically. So what can we do as an international community? What needs to be done differently to try to shift that level of commitment?
Okay, well, I'll try and briefly respond to both of those. They're both great questions. I mean, for your question, you know, we have a lively debate within GPE and more broadly about incentive structures, and I was at Cambridge yesterday where payment by results got a little bit of a run in the conversation, which is something you'd kind of expect. But I do think even as we have a country-led development model, that we can build in some ways of incentivising true equity and universality. I mean, the structure we've developed through our new funding model of having potentially 30% of donor funds at risk depending on performance, I think strikes a pretty good balance between incentivising but not going, you know, 100% down the payment by results system, so that you are not addressing the capability building as you do it. So building capability and creating incentive at the same time. Now, you know, clearly others will have hundreds of ideas about how this can best be done, but those sorts of models are the ones that recommend themselves to me to try and put a very clear focus on the inclusion of children with disabilities. I think we've got to be pretty frank too that in areas like disabilities, you know, we'd be kidding ourselves if we thought that there was a set of obvious answers. I mean, we wander around saying things like our aspiration is to see the last child learning. Well, you know, Australia's a G20 economy. I was an education minister. We did a lot of reform, and I couldn't sit here today and put my hand on my heart and say the last child's learning in Australia. Because there are factors of exclusion, indigeneity, disability, you know, quality issues which still mean that some of our children aren't learning the way we want them to, and we struggle with that and we seek to improve. Given that complexity, when we turn to a developing country context and we're talking about including children with disabilities, I mean, often our minds run to the more simple solutions. The infrastructure has to have the, you know, ramps and kit that enable kids to get to go to school, and, you know, that's good, but it's that much of this bigger problem. And in our own nations, we're still struggling with a lot of this. So it's, you know, going to be about developing the models over time, so focusing on the inclusion, but recognising everybody's got something to learn as we go about it. And I think that is also true in the context of conflict. I mean, fully 50% of what we do now is in fragile and conflict-affected places. We've diversified our model so we can move money very quickly in circumstances of crisis. As we have this global conversation about new and better mechanisms, I think it's important that there's high-level political leadership, and I think Gordon Brown is doing a great job of that. It's important that there's the deep technical conversation, and that we don't let one become the enemy of the other. It's pretty easy to get to the political moment. I would have done it myself as a politician, where you go out and do the, you know, this is the grand new vision. Okay, now someone's going to work out how that's all going to work. And then there'd be plenty of times too where we don't generate political momentum because we're still puzzling through the technicalities. I think we've got to have these things on parallel tracks where there's the energy that is being created by things like Oslo is captured and channelled, and the technical work is running alongside, so that when we get the convergence of, yes, we want to do this as a global community, we've got the wherewithal to do it at the same time.
Thanks, Julia. So let's now throw it open. This is your chance. So let's start over on the right in the front row. And if you could remember to say who you are.
Hi, my name's Philippa Lee. I work for Malala Fund. We've talked a lot today about the level of ambition for education that's being set by the SDGs, and that's incredibly welcome. But that level of ambition has largely been set by those within the education community. And now the conversation is going to move to how do we implement that through mobilising the resources necessary in Addis in July. And that sits with a slightly different constituency of those who hold the purse strings. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts, Julia, on how you think Addis might or might not deliver for education in terms of the ambition that we've set out with the SDGs.
Yeah.
Thanks. We'll take three, Julia,
okay,
if that's
sure.
okay.
Okay.
And then two rows back.
David Archer from ActionAid, also from the board of the GPE. You talked about the importance of existing and new emerging donors coming on board to education, but it always seems to me that the most important thing is the extent to which the donor community can leverage greater domestic commitments, because the real prize in terms of mobilisation of resources lies in expanding domestic commitments, both as a share of the budget, the size of the budget overall, tax reform and so on. What more could GPE do, or other donors do, in your view, to really get that leverage working effectively?
Thanks, David. And the person next to you.
Thanks. Elaine Unterholzer from UCL Institute of Education. There was a kind of interesting kind of rhythm to the discussion, I think, which I think is typical of this area. Kevin said gender, you said girls, and then we spoke about financing. And the kind of discussion of gender equality and how gender equality links with what happens in schools, and the problem of gender inequitable distribution of funds doesn't seem to be on the agenda. So could you comment a little bit on where you place gender equality as an outcome and gender financing issues?
Okay, so there's one specific question on Addis, one on, I guess, leveraging GP influence to mobilise resources domestically, and then the gender issue.
Addis, I think it's a good thing that the UN Secretary-General actually positioned the financing conference. So I think we've learned something from the Millennium Development Goal Round, that we're having the conversation, as hard as it is about money, started at the right time instead of being left to the post-goal adoption. But having said that, Addis is going to open the conversation, not finish it. I think at the moment, when you look at the zero draft and how education is dealt with in the zero draft, it is getting the kind of focus that one would want. The discussions in Addis have to hold that focus, and then what comes out of Addis really needs to be campaigned on to unlock the funding. So this is going to be a journey in stages, not one big answer. On the leveraging point, I do think things like the way GPE is working, so that donor dollars need to leverage additional domestic expenditure. It's a good model for working, but part of the solution here lies outside the education community, and we do tend to silo, and we need to actually be joining hands with the people who do work with developing country governments to help build taxation systems that work and that are equitable, national accounting that is credible and can give people data. So we should be embracing the tribes of economists and statisticians and all of those people who make that their lifetime passion and cause, because if we don't get that bit right, then we're never going to be able to see the financing flows that we need. And on the gender equity agenda, I absolutely agree with you. This is about, inclusion, outcome and financing. So girls in schools, girls learning, girls transitioning to work or further education successfully, and girls having their education appropriately financed so that all of that becomes possible. It gets back to the conversation we had about differentiation of financing based on need. It's very easy for people either to have the money follow the politics, so the wealthier, more mobilised communities get more, or to adopt a simple per capita model so every child gets the same. Given levels of disadvantage, including disadvantage driven by gender, none of that is sufficient. There will have to be extra efforts for the poorest girls particularly, or they will not get the quality of education and the educational outcomes that they deserve.
I really couldn't agree more with you on the budgeting part. One of the programs we have here, actually we have two programs. We have an ODI fellowship program where we send postmaster students to work in mostly finance ministries in developing countries, and a budget support program. And the thing I'm always struck by, we often sit here in London talking about targets for spending, but back in the boiler room, when you're in countries which don't really have financial systems and budget systems where you can work out what's being allocated where, I mean, that's in some sense where the real challenges are. So let's move on to front row and then second row.
Thank you. Jenny Hamilton, University of London. One question that I'm really intrigued to know is, when we talk about education and universal education, what do we mean by education? Are we talking about formal education? And if so, what kind of formal education? And the reason I ask that is because there are debates here and in Australia about what constitutes education and what constitutes good education. Do we need history? Do we need art? Do we need math these days? So when we talk about education, I'm just curious to know what we're talking about there.
Thank you. And right behind you.
Hi there, Layla Azrari from the Royal Commonwealth Society. Commonwealth education ministers are meeting next week, so my question is, what outcomes should we be hoping for from this meeting, and can the Commonwealth add value here?
And is there any other questions here? Please.
I really enjoyed this discussion. And my main question is about the expectations that come with education. I'm from a developing country, I'm from DRC, and everyone who gets education expects a different type of job, office job, and there are no many economic opportunities. So how do you match this increase in education with economic opportunities?
Well, that's three tough questions.
Three tough questions, three good questions. I might start with yours and link back to this question. What do we want education to achieve? Well, looking at our own lives, what are we hoping that we've achieved, or that our children get to achieve through education? I think we want them to have the skills and capabilities to be empowered individuals and global citizens. We want them to understand the world and to be able to stake out their place in it. We want people to have the attributes and skills and capabilities that enable them to access the world of work and to build lives and have satisfying careers. So there's a straight economic agenda here, and there's a broader agenda about citizenship and empowerment. On the economic agenda, it is incredibly frustrating if we are educating people who then can't find a place in their domestic labour market that uses their skills. And one of the things that we need to think about in this age where job creation globally, as well as in individual country contexts, is a lagging demand for jobs, is how we foster the skills of entrepreneurship, which are going to enable people to not go out and become an employee, but actually go out and create a business. And in a separate capacity, I work with a global startup and philanthropic fund in Melbourne called DoSur that is very focused on this question of entrepreneurship, and I think it's an important one. What that ends up meaning for practical definitions about curriculum and what gets taught and all the rest of it because ours is a country-led development model, that would be worked on in country. But I do think we can say globally there are a set of core skills and capabilities you want people to have, and the work of the Learning Metrics Task Force has been about trying to map some of those from literacy and numeracy through to these global citizenship skills. On what can the Commonwealth do, as a former chair of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, the Commonwealth might quintessentially be a structure from an earlier time, but it happily brings together donor nations and developing countries, and consequently within the structures of the Commonwealth there's plenty of this kind of dialogue that can happen to then take out to the broader global forums that include more countries about how we're going to address these financing and capability gaps for education. I can imagine actually not only at the Education Ministers' meeting but when heads of governments meet at the Commonwealth, you could have a very lively conversation on a number of these issues, which would then rebound into further global discussions.
So I should have mentioned on your CV that you had in fact chaired the Commonwealth Heads of Government. I apologise for that.
That's all right.
Any final questions over here? One right here, and then one over there, and that'll be the last two. And if you could keep them both fairly brief, please.
Yes, I'm afraid I just want
to... If you just say who you are.
Oh, sorry, Ruth Jacobson. I'm an independent researcher. I just wanted to slightly complicate the situation with regard to dividing categories into conflict and post-conflict, because I've been studying Mozambique now for over 30 years, and although we've had the country has had heroic efforts to reconstruct its education system after decades of war, the latest World Bank service delivery indicators are absolutely appalling and have, in terms of the actual quality of education. So really it's more of a comment, but perhaps you could just give your reaction. Don't take your eyes off the ball when there's a political settlement, because there's always going to be ongoing problems.
Yeah. I think it's an important point that
Yes.
these aren't binary
categories. No, absolutely.
Lenny, you please say who you are.
Lenny Wild from here at ODI. Thank you very much for sort of setting out your vision of where you'd like to see this debate going in the future. You've mentioned at several points the need to think a bit about capabilities and capabilities of the education community globally. Could you say a little bit more about what you think needs to change there? Because I think we've also found from some of our research in this area that we need to focus not just on the total amount of financing that's needed, but on how we work and the way and the ways in which we work may need to be different as well.
I'll try and answer that question briefly. It's a very big question. If I had a magic wand, which unfortunately no one's ever given me, but
we can do
that. Here at ODI, they've got a cupboard full of them. That's fantastic. I think we would puzzle our way through and get to some answers on these global goods pieces, which would then be enabling platforms that enriched and amplified the in-country work and the development model that GPE has, but obviously so much gets done bilaterally too, that bilateral donors do. What do I mean by that? I think we would think of better ways of ensuring that there can be textbooks, learning material, technology, assessment modules and practices that there are global platforms with expertise that countries can draw down on, rather than feeling like they need to puzzle their way through all of that from the start. And that would mean if you could draw down on those inputs as you did your own country planning and then implementation of the plan, it would free up your domestic resources for getting more done than trying to do some of these things. To give you an Australian example, I talk about in the book developing a national curriculum. Australia, 23 million people, and we used to have curriculum writers in every state and territory in Australia. As Prime Minister, I used to wander around saying we had more curriculum writers in Australia per capita than any nation in the world. And, you know, call me crazy, but the laws of physics don't change when you jump over the border between Victoria and New South Wales. We ultimately fix that. We've got a national curriculum agency. It means resources that used to get used for, you know, doing physics in Victoria and physics in New South Wales can now be used for other things. Now, can we globally conceptualise global good provision and supply chains that gives us those kinds of efficiencies within country? I think we can, and that would mean our dollars within country, both the domestic expenditure and the donor dollars, were doing more work. So there would be that. The second thing, if I had my magic wand, is whilst we all talk about coordination, we'd actually do it. So one of the big frustrations, I think, for everybody in the development community, but particularly for our developing country partners, is donors talk about coordinating. We work on the education sector plan, but it all ends up very messy and lots of bits and pieces that don't fit together, even as we preach that people should have very sophisticated plans that coordinate things and therefore deliver education as an integrated whole, instead of a bit of infrastructure over there and a bit of professional development over there and a bit of IT, you know, innovation over here, that it should all fit together. We, the broad we, in the donor community make that so much harder to do than it needs to be, so we genuinely do the coordination. If we could get those things right, I think they would be the seeds of a step change.
Thanks, Julia. I know you have to leave sharp at 15:15, and I was actually asked to summarise the discussion, which I'm not even going to try to do. But, I mean, for me, there are two really big things that come out of what you said and also out of the book, actually, which is, one, that we have this moment of extraordinary opportunity with the Sustainable Development Goals, but I think the danger is that these ideas like leave no one behind and the commitment to equity will become devoid of content unless we can find ways of tackling the real equity concerns that you identified in Australia that we need to do at an international level. And actually the second area is that I think often educationalists have an instinct to the classroom and the school and a blind spot for the disadvantage that kids carry with them into the classroom. You know, whether it's the gender disadvantages or, you know, the disadvantages that drive kids into labour markets, into early marriage and so on. And actually this is really an opportunity to go across all the silos and to make education a focal point for a wider agenda, which is about eliminating extreme poverty and expanding opportunity. We actually have 2 minutes left, and I wanted to end so at 2:30, and I promise I was reading this at 2:30 in the morning, and it's not my copy, but so this is from our staff member, who I won't mention, but it's copiously underlined throughout.
I think we found
you've given yourself away. But I hope you don't mind. But you wrote this very lovely thing in the right at the end of the book.
No one's ever going to lend you a book again. You know that.
I know that's probably true. So, anyway, it's one sentence which says, "Thanks for making it easier for those of us who will try to follow you." Oh. Which I think says it all. Actually, I think you're an inspiration for huge numbers of people around the world, and in education, although you haven't been in the post that long, I think you've been a great source of inspiration for the education community too. The one price you have to pay is signing the book to Jessica.
I can do that. I can do that.
Thank you. And you, thank you, Julia, and we really hope you come back again fairly soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody. It's lovely. I'll do Jessica's book.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm getting signs from the front row here, which I forgot to tell you the really good news for those of you who don't have to leave straight away is that there is food outside.